It was just another morning at the busy downtown coffee shop, where people rushed in and out, grabbing their drinks before heading to work. Among them was an older woman, dressed in a simple but elegant outfit, her presence carrying a quiet confidence. She stood in line, waiting patiently for her turn, completely unaware that her day was about to take a shocking turn. Just a few feet away, Officer Bradley, a veteran cop with a reputation for being aggressive, was having a bad morning. His frustration boiled over as he barked at the barista for taking too long with his order. His eyes darted around the cafe, scanning the crowd like he owned the place. That's when his gaze landed on the woman standing nearby. Something about her rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was the way she stood tall, unfazed by the chaos around her. Or maybe, deep down, he just needed someone to take his anger out on. As she reached for her drink, a simple mistake set everything in motion. Her hand accidentally brushed against his, barely a touch, but enough for Bradley to snap. Without hesitation, he turned, sneering, and before she could even react, he did the unthinkable. He tossed his steaming hot coffee right at her. The entire cafe fell silent. Gasps filled the air as people watched in shock, unable to believe what they had just seen. The woman staggered back, her face burning not just from the heat, but from the sheer humiliation of the moment. And then, just as quickly as it happened, everything changed. Because what Officer Bradley didn't know, what no one in that cafe knew, was that the woman he had just assaulted wasn't just any random customer. She was the mother of the city's brand new chief of police, and in just a few moments, his entire world was about to come crashing down. What happens next? Stay tuned to find out. The cafe remained frozen in shock. The woman stood still, her hands trembling as she wiped the hot liquid from her face. A stunned silence hung in the air, broken only by the soft hum of the espresso machine and the whispers of customers who couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Officer Bradley, however, felt no remorse. He smirked, shaking his head as if she had been the one at fault. "Watch where you're going, lady," he muttered, turning back to grab a napkin, completely unaware that his reckless outburst had just sealed his fate. The woman took a slow breath, her sharp eyes locked onto him. There was no yelling, no dramatic reaction, just a quiet, calculating stare. A few nearby customers fumbled for their phones, recording the aftermath, but she remained composed, as if she already knew how this was going to end. Then the cafe door swung open. A young officer, fresh on the job, stepped inside, his uniform still crisp from this morning's briefing. He spotted the woman immediately, his face going pale. He knew exactly who she was. He rushed forward, his voice tight with concern. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Officer Bradley looked up, confused. "What's the problem? She's fine." The younger officer ignored him. "Do you need me to call the chief?" he asked her softly. And that's when Bradley's smirk started to fade. "Chief." The word hit him like a punch to the gut. His eyes darted back to the woman, really looking at her for the first time. The strong posture, the quiet authority, things he had ignored before, and suddenly it clicked. He had seen her before in photographs, standing beside someone powerful, someone whose name he should have never crossed. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just some random woman. This was the mother of his new boss, and if the chief hadn't already heard about this, he would soon. Bradley swallowed hard. His world had just changed in an instant. And the worst part, this was only the beginning. The silence between them was thick. Officer Bradley's hands twitched at his sides, his mind racing as he tried to process what he had just done. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. Maybe there was a way out of this. Maybe if he played it cool, it wouldn't turn into something bigger. But the younger officer wasn't letting it slide. His voice was firmer now, laced with something Bradley hadn't expected: fear. "Ma'am, I think we should step outside." The woman nodded, still eerily composed, and let the officer guide her toward the exit. Bradley watched them go, his pulse quickening. Customers were still whispering, some throwing him uneasy glances. A few had their phones up, recording. He clenched his jaw. This was bad, but it wasn't over yet. Outside, the cold air hit the woman's face, soothing the lingering burn from the coffee. She exhaled slowly. She wasn't shaken, not the way most people might have been. No, she had seen men like Bradley before, arrogant, reckless, careless with their authority, but this time he had picked the wrong person to mess with. She turned to the young officer. "What's your name?" "Officer Tate, ma'am." He stood straight, clearly nervous. I didn't know this happened until I walked in." She nodded. "You've done nothing wrong." Her voice was steady, but her mind was already working through what would happen next. There was no need to call her son. He would find out soon enough. The moment those videos hit social media, there would be no stopping the storm that was coming. Back inside, Bradley took a deep breath, glancing around the cafe. The barista avoided his eyes. A couple near the counter whispered to each other. He reached for his coffee, but his hand shook. He cursed under his breath and set it back down. His radio crackled. A call from dispatch. Routine. He didn't answer. His gut told him he had bigger problems now. And he was right, because at that very moment, the chief of police was just minutes away from seeing the first video. And when he did, Officer Bradley's career, and maybe his entire life, would never be the same again. Bradley's hands were sweating now. He could feel the weight of every stare in the cafe, the quiet judgment settling on him like a heavy blanket. He wanted to walk out, act like nothing had happened, but his feet wouldn't move. His mind kept circling back to the way that young officer had looked at the woman, the fear, the urgency. It was more than just concern, it was respect. And if a rookie like him knew exactly who she was, then Bradley had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Outside, the woman stood near the curb, her phone in her hand but untouched. She wasn't in a rush. There was no need. These things had a way of unraveling on their own. She had lived in this city long enough to understand how quickly power could shift, how men like Bradley built their entire worlds on authority they didn't deserve, and how, in a single moment, it could all come crushing down. Officer Tate shifted beside her, clearly on edge. "Ma'am, if there's anything I can do." She gave him a small, knowing smile. "You've already done enough." Across town, inside a sleek office lined with plaques and awards, a phone buzzed. The chief of police glanced down at his screen, his face unreadable. A message. A video link. A subject line that made his stomach tighten. **** your mother. Officer Bradley. Downtown cafe. ***. He clicked it. The screen filled with the shaky recording. The cafe, the customers, the moment of impact. The hot coffee hitting his mother's face. The way she stood there, silent and still, while the man responsible turned his back like nothing had happened. A slow breath left his lungs, controlled but heavy. His fingers curled into a fist on his desk. He had barely been in office a month, barely settled into the impossible weight of leading this city's department. And now, on his screen, was proof that one of his own had made a reckless, career-ending decision. He reached for his radio. Back at the cafe, Bradley's radio crackled again. This time, a sharp voice cut through the static. "Officer Bradley, report to headquarters." Immediately, his stomach dropped. This was it, the moment everything came crashing down. Bradley's throat went dry. The radio call had been brief, but the weight behind it was crushing. His instincts screamed at him to do something. Denny, deflect, find a way out. But there was no way out, not this time. The cafe felt smaller now, the walls closing in as he moved toward the door. His steps were stiff, unnatural. He could feel the eyes on him, watching, waiting. Some of them still had their phones up. He gritted his teeth. If this went viral, when this went viral, his name would be everywhere. Outside, Officer Tate stood rigid, his face tight with something Bradley couldn't quite place. Not fear, not anger, something worse. Pity. The woman was still there, calm as ever. She hadn't spoken to him, hadn't acknowledged him beyond that one chilling stare. That silence was worse than any words she could have said. Bradley swallowed hard and turned away, heading toward his patrol car. He needed time to think. He needed a plan. But before he could reach the door handle, a second voice cut through the tense air. Bradley. It wasn't the radio this time. It was real. It was close. And when he turned around, his heart nearly stopped. Standing on the sidewalk, a few feet away, was Chief Harris. He wasn't at headquarters. He wasn't behind a desk. He was here, in person. And worse, he wasn't alone. 2 internal affairs officers stood at his sides, their expressions unreadable. The chief's face was like stone, his gaze locked onto Bradley with an intensity that made the air feel thick. Lisa exhaled, trying to keep her voice calm. We just saw the truth in action. Collins had been part of something bigger. He had been sent to intimidate her, maybe more. But when his backup fled, it became clear that whoever was behind this had realized they had made a mistake. They hadn't expected her to put the pieces together so quickly, and they certainly hadn't expected her to get away. She reached for her phone, hitting a number she knew by heart. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Lisa, it's late. I need you to pull some files. Now. A pause. Then, what kind of files? Lisa's eyes flicked to the mirror. No sign of the SUV, the ones we weren't supposed to find. Her contact understood it immediately. Got it. Sending what I can. She hung up and tightened her grip on the wheel. She had been fighting corruption for years, exposing those who abused their power. But tonight had proved something dangerous. Whoever she was up against was willing to cross lines they couldn't take back. Her son exhaled shakily. Are we safe? Lisa glanced at him, her heart twisting. For now. But she knew the fight wasn't over. This wasn't just about one cop, one stop. This was about a system built to silence people like her, but they had underestimated her. Lisa Carter had spent her entire life fighting for justice, and tonight they had just given her another reason to keep going.